Hey everyone, I hope all is well. In this video, we'll be learning how to implement custom theming and dynamic styles while using CSS variables. On the left, I have the final project that we'll be building. It's nothing too fancy, but it'll help with getting a general idea of the capabilities of CSS variables. So what we have on the left side is 3 inputs, 2 of which are color inputs and 1 is a range input. And then on the right hand side, we have some lorem ipsum dummy text. This is just going to help us visualize our dynamic changes. So if I go ahead and play around with these inputs, you can see that we can change the background color and we can also change the text color. Let's just slide this up. And we can change the font size in different step values. So this is all possible with the help of CSS variables and just a little bit of JavaScript. So let's go ahead and refresh this. If you'd like to follow along, I've added a link in the description to the GitHub repo associated with this video. It contains all the starter files you need to get up and running. Let's move to our editor and you can go ahead and open up the index.html file and let's take a quick glance at this just so we see what we have. So if we move down here, I have a div with the ID of container, and this is essentially just a wrapper for our entire page. Right below that, I have another div with a class of subcontainer. This is going to house both of our sections. And the first section that we have is the input section, and this is holding all of our inputs. So I have the background color input, the text color input, and then the font size input. Right below that, we have our last section, which is on the right, and it's the text section, and it's just housing an h1 and 2 p tags with lorem ipsum text. If we move into the package.json quickly, if you look at div dependencies, I'm using parcel bundler just to kind of bootstrap our dev environment. So we can run this command, which is dev. So we'll do yarn dev. And what this is going to do is it's going to run parcel at an entry point of index.html and give us a localhost at port 1234. So let's go ahead and open up this. And you can see that it's very similar to the final project. The only difference is that the font is a little bit different and we don't have the background color, but this is going to be done dynamically. So let's not worry about that right now. Let's move into the styles.css file and let's just take a look at this real quick. All of the styles that have been pre-filled are just basic styles. This is just to give us some structure and get right into working with CSS variables. So just as a quick overview, I'm giving some styling to the body, the label, the input. As you can see, our subcontainer has a display of grid. This is what's giving us both of these columns and centering everything. It has a max width of 900. And then our input group is getting display flex with justify content, which is over here. And this is the spacing that you see between the label and the actual input. Now, what exactly are CSS variables? So they're custom properties that act as a value for CSS declarations within your style sheet. So you may or may not be familiar with CSS preprocessors such as Sass and Less, but what they do is they allow you to store values within custom variables. And then what you can do is then take those variables and use them within your style sheet instead of having to repeat the value over and over again. So that's kind of confusing without seeing it in practice. So what we're going to do is we're going to create our first variable now. So what we can do is within the root, we're going to place our first variable. And just as a quick side note, I've added a link in the description to this article by Kevin Powell discussing the differences between storing your CSS variables within the global scope or having them locally scoped. And he gives some really good examples over here. So I'll leave this article in the description and you can check it out on your own time. But for the time being, just as common practice, I'm just going to put everything in the root. In order to define the variable, it has a specific syntax. So we're going to use 2 hyphens followed by a variable name, and then we're going to write the actual value. So it looks like this. So 2 hyphens, and then we'll just say background color, colon, and then we want the background color to have a value. And as you can see over here, there's this yellow color. So if we go into our index.html, and we go to the background color input, you can see that the default value is this yellow color. So I'm going to copy this and then we can go ahead and paste it in here and then close this off. Now let's just go over this real quick. So all you need is 2 hyphens and then a variable name, colon, and then the actual value you want. This variable name could be anything you want, and then you can also type it like this. So this will be camel case, but in this instance, I prefer hyphen just because I think it aligns with the 2 hyphens that go right before it. Now, the next thing we need to do is target this text color. So you can see the text color has this black right here. So we can go down here and then 2 hyphens, and then we'll just call it text color, colon, and then we'll just do 000. And the final one is the font size. So what we can do is call it, let's say, base font, and then we'll give it a value of 16 pixels. Now that we've defined all of our CSS variables, let's go ahead and apply them to this text section over here. We're going to remain in the styles.css file and head to the very bottom, right below the input group. We can go ahead and we can target that text section. And what we want to do is we want to access the background color and change its value using one of the CSS variables up above. In order to declare a CSS variable, we need to write the var function, which looks like this. So you'll write var, open and close parentheses, and within the parentheses is where you want to use the actual CSS variable. So we'll do 2 hyphens, background color. And as you can see, the background for the text section has changed. And if we head back up here and we attempt to change this color to something else, you'll notice that it changes accordingly. So we can bring this back. And the next 2 things we want to do is target the text color and the font size. So we'll do color, var, and then it's text color. And then, oops, font size, we want the base font. If we go ahead and attempt to change any one of these input values, you notice that nothing's going to change. And this is because currently all the values associated for each input are static. So in order to change this, we're going to need to incorporate a little bit of JavaScript. Before we do that, let's just give this text section a little bit of padding. So we'll say padding, and we'll give it a padding of 1.2 rem. So that looks a little bit better. Now let's go ahead and move into the index.js file, and we can go ahead and remove this console.log. So in here, what we need to do is create a way to grab our inputs and have some function that gets called on each input change. So we can start with creating a variable and then storing all of our inputs within that variable. So we'll say const inputs equals, and then we'll do document dot, and then we'll do query selector all, and we want all of the inputs. Now we need a function that stores some logic that says do this whenever our inputs changes. So we can say const, and in this instance I'm going to use an arrow function, so we'll say handle input equals, it's going to take the event argument. Now in here, this is where we want all of our logic. In our handle input function, we need a way to access our inputs and change their values, and we can do that by accessing the root element. So we'll do document dot document element, and then we'll use the style property followed by the set property method. Now, what this is saying is that document element is going to grab the root element, which in our case is the HTML element. We're going to use the style property so that we can actually set styles, and then the set property method is going to allow us to change those styles dynamically. And this is basically where all the magic happens. So set property takes in 3 arguments, but we're only going to be using the first 2. So the first argument is going to be the property we want, and the second is going to be the property's new value. The trick here is that all of our inputs have an ID that is exactly the same as our CSS variable names, and that's something that's key. So if we go to our index.html file and we look at our first input, we see that it has an ID of background color. Our second input has an ID of text color, and our third input has an ID of base font. And all of those IDs are exactly the same as our CSS variable names. Now, the only difference is that for our CSS variables, obviously we have to write 2 hyphens in the front because that's how the syntax is. So using JavaScript, we can use template literals inside of our set property method, and then we can form them into CSS variables. So we can open this up here, and then we can say 2 hyphens, and then what we want is we want to target the element. So we can do event.target.id, and this is going to target the element by its ID, which is going to be our CSS variable. Now we want it to change dynamically, so the new value is going to be whatever value we select for that input. So what we can do is this. So we'll do template literal, and then we'll say event.target.value, and that's going to be whatever value we select when we change it. Something to take note of is that the value for our font size has a suffix at the end. So all this means is that there's a value followed by a string. So if we move into our styles.css file and we look at the base font, we can see that it's 16px. This px at the end is the actual suffix. Now, what happens is if we attempt to change the value in our input for the font size, nothing's going to happen because it requires that whole value. So in order to add the suffix at the end, we can move up here and we can say const suffix is going to be equal to event.target.id. And if that ID is equal to the base font, then what we want is pixels. Otherwise, just give us an empty string. And then in order to attach this at the end, we're going to use string interpolation, and then we're just going to say suffix. The last thing that we need to do is loop over each input and attach an event listener to the input event, which then is going to trigger our handle input function. So we can move down here and we can say inputs dot, and we're going to use for each, and then for each input, we want to do input dot add event listener, and in here we want to listen for the input and then call our handle input. Now we go ahead and we attempt to change this color. You can see that the background's changing and this works. Let's go ahead and see if we can change the text color. The text color is working now, and let's change the font size, and the font size is working. Let's quickly recap on what we did. So if we move up above, we've created an inputs variable that's simply storing all of our input elements. Then we have a handle input function that takes in the event argument, and we're saying document.document element, so we can grab the root element. In our case, it's the HTML element. We're using the style property to set styles, and we're attaching the set property method, which takes in a property as the first argument, and then that property's new value as the second element. So in our case, we've given an ID to each of our inputs, and then ID corresponds to the ID of our CSS variable. So we're saying whatever event.targetID is, which in our case would be whatever the input is, so ID is base font, we want to turn that into a CSS variable, and we did this using string interpolation. So we added 2 hyphens and we did event.targetID. The new value is going to be event.target.value, and the target value is whatever color or range you select for the input. And then for the font size, we had to add a suffix, and this suffix, like we discussed, is this px at the end of the 16. So what we did was we did event.target.id, and if the target ID is base font, so if we click on any one of these and this equals base font, then we want to attach a px at the end. Otherwise, just give us an empty string. So this is not going to affect any of the colors. Then down below, what we did, we said inputs.forEach, so we're looping over each of our inputs, and our inputs are over here. And then we said for each input, we want to add an event listener, and we want to listen for an input. And when that input gets fired, we want to call our handle input function, which is this function over here, and we're going to do all this logic. And that's it. Hopefully this video gave you a better understanding of CSS variables and how to incorporate dynamic themes and dynamic styling. Until next time, I hope you guys stay well.